And so let's go back and really quickly talk about corporate structures, right? We had that lesson about corporations and LLCs and partnerships and whatnot. So in this case, we're talking always about real C corporations, right? Real corporations that have this structure to them. And if someone is trying to sell you shares or units in an LLC, your answer should be, no, 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 I don't do that. I'm not your, I'd like to be your partner, but I would like to own shares in a company. And here's why. Because in the standard company, there's 4 layers. The top layer are the shareholders who think they're the owners, and I'm not going to go into why they're not exactly the owners, but they own shares in the company that they do own, and they have the right by law to approve certain things. So when the articles of incorporation need to be changed, the shareholders have to vote for that, right? Everyone else below that has no say. The shareholders approve whether or not the articles of incorporation get changed. And in there are things like allocating new shares and creating new classes of shares. So you can't raise money without changing your articles of incorporation because you need more shares to sell. You can't change the number of members in the board without shareholder approval. You can't sell the company without shareholder approval. I didn't put that on this, but you need your owners, you need your shareholders to say yes if you're trying to sell the company. So within that, and there's the articles of incorporation, then there's these shareholder agreements that get created whenever there are shareholders that get added in. And so between those two, they'll decide who's picking the board of directors. And the board of directors represents the shareholders ultimately, and not necessarily all the shareholders. It's not like a public company where there's just one kind of shares. So the shareholders from Series A represent the Series A investors, and the board member from Series Seed represents the Series Seed investors. And the CEO is usually on the board, and he represents the management team, but he's really representing the common shareholders because he's usually a common shareholder. And the founder might be on the board if he's not the CEO, and he represents the common shareholders. So everyone brings their own agenda to this board. When everything's going well in the company, that doesn't matter. When there are big decisions to be made, then you suddenly notice that everyone has their own agenda. So the board of directors, they have a fiduciary responsibility to watch over this company, to make sure it's not making stupid decisions. And they have to approve major decisions. And there's a list in the articles of incorporation of the bylaws of exactly which decisions are board decisions. And it's usually things like who's the management, hiring and firing, not just the CEO, but the whole management team is usually a board decision. Handing out any shares. So if you're doing the stock option, if you're sharing equity with the employees, like most tech companies do, then every time there is a share allocation, the CEO can't do that himself or herself. They have to go to the board of directors and get approval. So like usually the beginning of the board of directors meetings is just going through and doing those approvals. But there could be other things like taking out some loans, right? So going and getting some debt. If you want a bank loan, you have to get board of director approval of that. Even if you want to open a bank account, right? You have to go get board of directors approval on that. And ultimately, board of directors is basically hiring the management team to then run the company on a daily basis, and they're making the big decisions, big strategic decisions, including hiring and firing the employees. And those employees are the ones that are actually bringing in the customer revenue, right? They make the product, they do the sales, they do the marketing, and so forth. And so that's the structure you should have in your head when I talk about wanting a board seat. And that brings us to the second set of preferences, which are generally called restrictive covenants. There's a few other names for these things, but it's the same kind of list that I just said exists for the board of directors. You can put in your shareholder agreement that you, the shareholders of Series A, Series C, Series B, Series C, have the right to approve or disapprove the following list of actions. And it's the same kind of list. I've seen 15 line items on here. I've seen 25 line items on here, including you can't make a purchase over $10,000 without approval of these investors, which I thought was crazy, and I pushed back on that. You can't hire or fire anyone on the management team without the approval of this specific small set of investors, right? You can't sell any shares, which means you can't raise money without the approval of this set of investors. So it's kind of like having a board within a board, except it could be everybody, it could be unanimous consent of this group of shareholders. It could be, it's often super majority, could be 67%, where there are 2 investors, they each own 50% of that class of shares. So it really means unanimous consent of those investors. These can be pretty restrictive. And so when we do venture scale companies, there's usually a lot of back and forth negotiations about setting needs, but there's almost always restrictive covenants. When we do angel deals, there's usually a lot less of this, but there still might be, you can't raise more money without asking.